everybody, welcome back. Welcome to the show. I'm Glentendo. This week, I'm actually flying solo. So this podcast will finally be living up to the name, the Glentendo podcast. It's just me and you on an intimate podcast evening. It's just going to be me and it's just going to be you. So there's a lot of news to get through, actually. I think some people think it was a slow week, but as you'll see, there's actually a lot to talk about. Where do I start here? What have I been playing? We always start with what we've been playing. So I've been playing Mario 3D Collection on Switch, and that game is awesome, obviously. I've been waiting my whole life to play this game again, to play Mario 64 again, and to play all these games portably is just so sick. So I've been making my way through that. It's interesting because I'm surprised by how much I remember, how well I remember everything in Mario 64. I only played it once on the N64, and I played the remake on the DS, and then I played the Wii Virtual Console version again. But that game is just so iconic and so memorable that I'm finding myself just like not surprised by anything at all. I thought I was going to be way more surprised by this game. Like, it's just been so long since I remember playing it. But as I'm playing it, all these memories come back and I'm like, oh yeah, you just go here, you do this. Like all the secret stars, like the ones that are really, really secret, I'm just remembering where they all are pretty easily. So yeah, I've been playing that, and I've also been playing Among Us. This game seems to have popped off a lot in the last few weeks. Everyone seems to be playing this game. I'm playing it on my iPhone, which is strange because I actually really hate mobile games, but I'm really enjoying this one. For anyone who doesn't know or hasn't played Among Us yet, Among Us is basically you create a room of 10 players, right? And you play as these little astronaut dudes that are tasked with fixing a spaceship, right? So you have to roam the spaceship and do your little tasks, and everyone has different tasks and stuff. And there are one or two imposters among your group, and you need to discern who the imposters are before they kill your whole team. So while you're doing tasks, the imposters sneak up behind you and they just kill you. Now, if you witness someone being killed, you report it, and then it goes into a chat mode and everybody talks, and they have to discuss like, oh, I saw blue do it over here and this, and then someone else will call you out and go, wait, that can't be true because I saw blue on the other side of the map, so maybe you're the imposter. And so you get into fights, you start arguing, it ends a lot of friendships, and that's the fun of it. By the end of this game, you don't have anyone to talk to in real life because you're so heated from accusing each other and finding out how good your friends are at lying to your face. That's what the real thing that makes this game amazing. So that game's awesome. Been playing that way too much. Like, honestly, my sleep schedule is so bad, bro. I keep telling myself that I'm not going to play Smash or Among Us past midnight because it just turns into the classic thing of just one more. And then you're up until 4. Dude, yesterday I was playing Among Us. I started at 11:30 p.m. and I didn't go to sleep until 3:30, close to 4. I was like, oh my God, why do I keep doing this to myself, man? So, but yeah, it's been really fun. And especially because quarantine, I haven't seen anybody in months. It feels like years. It feels like a decade. It's kept me feeling like I'm hanging out with some of the old friends and stuff. We'll get in a Discord call and we'll do a voice chat and we'll play the game and stuff. And highly recommend it. It's free. It's pretty much it's on Steam. It's on PC, but not Mac. And it is on iOS and probably Android. So I definitely recommend it. Maybe this game, it's been so popular. Maybe it's going to come to the Switch now, which it would probably work really well on Switch. You know, post-COVID, I don't know. But if before COVID happened, I would have said this is a great game for Switch because I could just see myself going to like a big Smash event or going to, anywhere that I go where all my friends are together and we all have our own screen. And so it would work perfectly for that. So you could do like local multiplayer in a way that you can't with, a phone or your PC. But yeah, now that COVID's here, I don't know how many people are actually going to want to do that. But really great game. Maybe it will come to Switch. That'd be cool. But yeah, that and Mario 3D Collection and just too much Smash past midnight. Honestly, this 3D collection, right? It's been making me think a lot about how their next year is Zelda's 35th anniversary. And I've been thinking a lot about, what if they make a collection like this, but for Zelda? The Wind Waker Wii U port to the Switch or Twilight Princess HD, both of those games trapped on the Wii U. And I wonder if we're going to get Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask remakes from the 3DS ported into the Switch, or if they'll just give us the originals, because Ocarina of Time, for the most part, everyone's kind of on board. Like the Zelda community is pretty much on board that that's a great, great remake. But Majora's Mask, there were a lot more changes in the remake. And I love the Majora's Mask remake, but I also know a lot of people who found the changes to be a little too much. They changed a lot of stuff. They changed the placement of certain things in the game. So, for example, there is a banker that you leave your money with so that when you go back in time, you don't lose your money. You keep it in the bank and he gives you a stamp, right? So like, this is how much money you have. So they changed the placement of where he is. Like in the original game, he's in like this corridor in the town, like to the left of the town square. But in the remake, he's behind the clock tower so that it's easier for the player to kind of just go to him, deposit their money, go back in time before they run out of time, before the 3 days are up. So there's stuff like that. They changed some of the boss fights and they added some bottles to the game. Ocarina of Time has nothing that drastic. Like most of the stuff in Ocarina of Time is like interface stuff. They didn't really add items to the game or anything like that. So I don't know. I personally think the Majora's Mask remake is beautiful. It looks great. I don't think they added anything that fundamentally made the game feel like a completely different experience. But I respect people that are, purists. So I don't know. Thinking about Zelda 35th anniversary next year, I wonder how they're going to tackle that. I wonder if they're just going to like ignore the 3DS remakes and go, here's Wind Waker HD and Skyward Sword HD and Twilight Princess HD and just leave us alone. Like, here's 3 games. Enjoy. Man, I can't believe it's been 10 years since the 25th anniversary. I remember getting the tickets to the Zelda Symphony concert and going and also buying Skyward Sword. And it was all part of this 25th anniversary thing. And man, time really flies, man. Holy God. And the other funny thing, another thing to think about when it comes to the anniversaries and stuff is that poor Metroid, man. Metroid has the exact same anniversary year as Zelda. So I remember back when Zelda turned 25, it was so funny because like they literally didn't mention Metroid's 25th anniversary at all. It was just all about Zelda for the whole year, and there was nothing about Metroid. There was not even like a t-shirt, a mention, a tweet, literally nothing. So next year, I wonder if they're going to acknowledge it. I mean, maybe Metroid Prime 4 is going to be coming along and it'll line up. Maybe we'll finally get that Metroid Prime trilogy port that has been rumored now for so long. And it's apparently the rumor is that it is finished. It's been finished for over a year. It's just sitting on a shelf waiting for them to kind of coincide the launch with something else Metroid related. So I don't know. Maybe we'll get a half Zelda, half Metroid year. Maybe Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out next year. So maybe Zelda will just take up the entire year and no one's going to talk about Metroid. But I just wish Metroid came out like a year later. So it's like we could have a Mario anniversary, we could have a Zelda anniversary, and then we could have Metroid. And 3 years in a row, you're just celebrating the 3 best video game franchises like Not even close. Like, I don't think it's even debatable that Mario's number one. I would even say Zelda's probably number one. And then Metroid is third place. Like, that franchise is incredible. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. That's what I've been playing. And speaking of anniversaries, September 23rd, 2 days ago, Nintendo as a company, the company turned 131 years old as of September 23rd. I mean, that's just insane. It's funny too because the company is synonymous with video games, right? Nobody even really would think that Nintendo's that old of a company. They're older than Disney. You know what I mean? But yeah, they've only been making video games since 1977 about. And then they didn't become famous for video games until 1985. So they were almost 100 years old before they really took off making video games. Before that, they started off as a Hanafuda playing card company. And then they experimented in the 60s and the 50s with like different types of businesses and outside of the playing cards. And then in the 70s, they went into video games, and the 80s happened, and that's when we got all the classic video game stuff that we know about today, and the video game industry as a whole, because Atari had killed it with horrible games like E.T., and no one wanted to buy video games. And then, Nintendo was like, bet, we got this, bro. So happy birthday to Nintendo. And there are some new games to play on Switch that we should probably talk about. This one game, very long awaited, very popular game, very popular indie game, Rivals of Aether Definitive Edition, just came out on Switch. It's a 2D sprite-based platform fighter, kind of like Smash Brothers, but in 2D. It actually started as a fan-made 2D Smash game called Super Smash Land. And then they eventually made like a sequel with original characters, and that evolved into what we have now, Rivals of Aether. So one of the differences is, like, unlike Smash, where every character is like a famous character from other games, Rivals has a pretty original roster, but they do have two special fighters, guest fighters, Shovel Knight and Ori. So that's pretty awesome. The game is $30. And yeah, it's a great game. It's like super popular in the Smash community. It appeals to that same group, but in a lot of ways, you could say that Rivals, it actually appeals to the competitive Smash community more than Smash does in a lot of ways, because it was more designed for that. It kind of came out of that community. And so unlike Smash, where the competitive community is definitely catered to, but it's not like the primary focus, there is way more effort on the development side for Rivals competitively. And so there's a lot of balances. There's a lot of balance patches for the characters and stuff. And so definitely pick that up if you want a 2D Smash Brothers style game. It's a beautiful game. There's awesome artwork, and yeah, that's an awesome game. And then there's another 4-player platform fighter came out this week, Kirby Fighters 2, which it actually got leaked like 2 days ago or 3 days ago, and then it came out. And it's a 4-player platform-based fighter, but it's not like Smash, where the goal is to ring people out. Smash and Rivals, those are ring out games, right? Where like you build the percentages and then people fly off stage, and your goal is to not hit the blast zone. This game is a little more traditional. It has like a health meter, and it's more power up based. So the only character you could play as far as I know, maybe they have secret characters, but the concept of the game is that you play as Kirby's different powers. And so it's all very power up focused. There's the sword Kirby and the Kirby with the yo-yo and all that stuff. So that game is $20. It's a smaller game. So pretty good week if you guys want 4-player platform fighters on the Switch. So yeah, that's what's come out. And we have some really, really big news to talk about. So this is a Nintendo focused podcast, right? But the biggest news of this week, and probably in my opinion, this is the biggest news maybe of this year and maybe even of this console generation. So Microsoft bought ZeniMax Media as a whole. So ZeniMax might not be a name that means much to anybody, but that includes Bethesda, id Software, Machine Games, Tango Gameworks, and a bunch of other studios that make, huge games like Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, Doom, Wolfenstein. These are insanely huge properties, right? And like I said earlier, this is a Nintendo podcast, so a lot of people might be wondering why are we talking about this? Why is this such big news? And I think there's so much here that implicates video games as a whole and also Nintendo. Like, we're going to see this through the lens of a Nintendo fan. If you're if you're really into Nintendo, what does this really mean? And we're going to talk a lot about that, right? So this deal is huge. They bought ZeniMax Media for $7.5 billion, which is, that's way more money than Microsoft paid for Rare back in the day, in the early 2000s. It's triple what they paid for Mojang, the creators of Minecraft. It's more money than even how much Disney paid for Star Wars. This is like an insanely huge amount of money. 7.5 billion, bro. Like, this is just like, it's like cartoon money, where it's like, we have no normal people like you and I, we have no idea what $1 billion would be, let alone 7 billion. So this is a big acquisition, right? And a lot of people are asking a lot of questions like, oh, what does this mean in terms of, does this mean that Skyrim or, the new Elder Scrolls games, Fallout, Wolfenstein, Doom, are these just Microsoft exclusives now? So this is interesting from a Nintendo perspective for a few reasons, right? Because Bethesda was one of the first really big names to support the Switch straight out of the gate. We've gotten Doom 2016. We got Wolfenstein 2. We got the Elder Scrolls, the Skyrim port for the Switch. And that was like, even in the Switch reveal, they showed Skyrim and stuff. And they've constantly been porting their biggest games, their most modern games, to the Switch. They've been figuring out how to do it, and some of these ports are really, really impressive. One of the things that they talked about too is how, when Doom Eternal was announced, they were talking about how, unlike Doom 2016 and unlike Wolfenstein, they were going to launch Doom Eternal on Switch day and date with the Xbox and PlayStation versions of the game. And, in interviews, they were talking about how they really want to treat the Switch like a first-class citizen. There was a lot of conversations about how there's this chicken or egg thing with Nintendo and third parties, where it's always like, oh, the third parties don't perform well on Nintendo platforms. But then there's this argument of, yeah, but you guys literally just port, old last-gen games to the system, or in EA's case, really gimped versions of, FIFA and stuff, and then blame the system that they don't do well. It's like you're doing ports of games that people don't care about anymore, or you're porting really bad games. So Bethesda was really the first one at the beginning of the Switch to come out and go, we're 100% like fully supporting it as much as we can. And then as of Doom Eternal, they were supposed to have, their next big, huge game be launching on the Switch next to their PS4 and Xbox One versions, right? Eventually, Doom Eternal did get delayed. The Switch version got delayed, and then COVID hit, and so the game still hasn't even come out. Although recently, I think last week, we saw that they did mention the Doom Eternal on Switch is still in development, and it's coming out very soon. They have more to announce soon, so they haven't forgotten about it. But now that Microsoft has bought, Bethesda and Machine Games and all of these studios, it's going to be interesting to see if this really affects that level of support on Switch. It's hard to tell, right? Because it feels like this acquisition, it's way more about competing with Sony. And Microsoft, as we keep talking about, and we talked about last episode with Ori, they don't really see Nintendo as a primary competitor. And this doesn't necessarily mean that these games are no longer going to be coming to the Switch, right? I'm a big fan of a lot of these games. Doom is one of my favorite games ever. I bought Wolfenstein 2. I bought Doom 2016. I was really excited that Doom Eternal was coming out on Switch. I'm primarily a Switch player, for better or for worse. So I'm really excited about those games, and I really hope that this doesn't mean that those games don't come to the Switch anymore. But they've said, actually, Microsoft has come out and said that they're going to be looking at these games as a case by case basis now, and any prior contracts that they had for a game to come out on a specific platform, whether like there's this game they announced called Starfield that's supposed to be a PlayStation exclusive, and they're still honoring all of that. It's really going to affect everything moving forward after all these games that have already been in development are finished and they start new development cycles. So we're not sure, but we should point out that like when Microsoft bought Mojang, the creators of Minecraft still came out on everything. And even as recently as, this year, where Mojang put out Minecraft Dungeons, that came out on Switch, that came out on PlayStation, that came out on Xbox. Like, this isn't necessarily the end of these games appearing on other platforms. So that's the first thing. And that's where Switch owners should be, that's where by the time that this is all said and done, the Switch will be probably on the verge of maybe a Switch 2. So as far as the next couple of years, I don't think this purchase is really going to affect Switch owners directly. But the reason why this is a big deal, and the reason why I really want to talk about this, is because for two reasons. So the first reason is that if you're a fan of these games, even outside of Nintendo, just in general, there is a little bit of reason for concern, because a lot of people don't realize that Microsoft, this is not really that unprecedented, in the sense that Microsoft has, even since the very early days of the Xbox, they've bought an insane amount of studios. Like, if you just look at in the last 20 years, they've bought so many studios. And the reason why this is something to be concerned about is because many of those studios that they've bought have either been sold off or closed, right? So you have like Lionhead Studios, which was really famous during the original Xbox era for making the Fable games. They've just been completely closed off, and they had like 10 projects that were canceled before the studio was just completely closed. And so there's a couple of examples like that. And obviously from a Nintendo perspective, there's Rare, and how Rare was really, they were a Nintendo exclusive studio, right? And they were a second party Nintendo studio. They made Donkey Kong Country. They made so many classic games. At one point, before Microsoft bought them, right, on the N64, just from like 1995 to the year like 2001, they put out 3 or 4 games a year, and 1 or 2 of those games every year was a classic. Like GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, Perfect Dark. Like, it was just nonstop, And then the second that Microsoft bought them, a lot of people assumed, just like they're assuming now, that, this means that, Banjo-Kazooie is going to be a exclusive, Microsoft Xbox property, and, Perfect Dark. And they were right, but the problem is that those games did not become, they actually lost a lot of quality on the way. And I actually don't think, I think it's pretty fair to say, I don't think anyone would really argue with the fact, with what I'm about to say, that like ever since Microsoft bought Rare has not made a single classic game. I don't think that's being too hard on them. Like, they have not made a great video game since they were bought 20 years ago. Almost actually to the day, I think it was September 24th. I did a little research on this before the show. September 24th, like 18 years ago. So they've just been a shell of what they were. It's not, a lot of times people leave. It's not the same thing. Like, it's not the same people at the company. A lot of people started different companies or went to other studios and stuff. So there's a lot of assumptions people are making that are still to be left to be figured out. I mean, one of the funny things about just thinking about all this stuff and thinking about when they bought Rare, the legend has it, right? Like, I don't know how much of this is really um, proven or how much of this you can quote people on, but the legend has it that there are these two brothers that own Rare, right? And they obviously had a great relationship with Nintendo. They were making, Rare has been making games since like the NES and Super Nintendo era, and then in the N64 era they really took off. And the legend has it that these two brothers wanted Nintendo to buy them out completely. And these guys were ready to retire. They wanted Nintendo to just pay to like own the company 100% and be fully absorbed into Nintendo as a first party. So at some point, Microsoft came around and showed interest in purchasing them because they were going to launch the Xbox and they wanted to purchase studios that were great at making video games. And the legend has it that the brothers actually had no intention of selling the company to Microsoft. They only entertained the idea so that they could force Nintendo to kind of be a little worried about it. And so apparently what happened was they asked Nintendo to buy them out, and the president at the time, Yamauchi, legendary, like, he was the president of Nintendo as they transitioned into video games. He was like, no, we don't really want to, like, you guys are already basically making exclusive games for us. Like, why would we pay more to buy you guys out? So the brothers went and they solicited Microsoft, and they took a bunch of meetings with Microsoft. And then Microsoft was like, hey, we're willing to buy you guys out for this amount. And so the brothers thought, okay, now that Microsoft's interested, we're going to call Nintendo's bluff, right? And we're going to be like, hey, Microsoft's going to buy us out unless you guys want to, you know? So at that point, they try to call Yamauchi's bluff, and he's like, bet, go ahead. And he just let it happen. And then Microsoft bought the company, right? The two brothers, they get the paycheck that they wanted and everything like that. They obviously Microsoft paid a huge amount of money, not 7.5 billion, but they paid a lot. And yeah, the company ended up going to Microsoft. But, you know, in Yamauchi's defense, you know, as much as Nintendo fans miss Rare games, especially in the GameCube era where there was like just software drought after software drought, as much as we miss those games and those properties and stuff, like, once Microsoft bought them, you know, morale at that company was just, it's not the same thing. A lot of people just instantly left and went to go do other things. Some of them went to Retro Studios, went on to make Metroid Prime. Some of them went to like Free Radical and make Time Splitters, and people went all over the place. So yeah, just a little quick Rare history on Microsoft and Nintendo. So that was reason number one that people should be a little worried about this, because Microsoft's history of buying studios and the quality that they put out after the fact it can be a little spotty. They did say this week that they plan, I think they've learned from those mistakes and all those studios they've had to close after buying. And so, you know, Mojang is doing pretty well, and they did say this week that Bethesda is still going to be run independently, but they're just under the Microsoft umbrella. So a lot of times, like, that's stuff that they kind of know they have to say that just so that fans don't get worried. But things are definitely going to change at those companies. It's not going to be like, oh, it's the same exact thing. It's just maybe they're not going to make the changes or the kind of changes they made in the past that ended up closing studios or making people leave those studios. So I'm personally not too worried about that part of it. I think you're still going to get great games from Bethesda, and you're still going to get great, you know, Doom and all that stuff. But the real reason that this is such a big news topic, the real reason I wanted to talk about this, and the real reason I think people should be concerned, is because I feel like no one's talking about this from a really long-term perspective. And the thing that this really reminds me of is how this is really all about Game Pass, right? So for those who don't know, if you're mostly a Nintendo guy like I am, Game Pass is basically Microsoft's Xbox's attempt at like a Netflix for video games type of thing. So basically, you pay a subscription model, right? So you pay X amount of dollars a month, like $20 a month, and you get access to all the games that they have and a huge library of games. And it's just like Netflix. You could watch and play whatever you want. And as long as you're paying that subscription, you have access to everything, right? So this is really about Game Pass. And this is really about making sure that Game Pass's value is just, uncontestable, because Sony and Nintendo have, this isn't really controversial to say. Like, I think it's pretty fair to say Nintendo has the best first party software, period. Like, no one's going to touch Smash and Zelda and Metroid and Mario, right? But Sony has a really good, strong first party, like exclusive lineup. Microsoft, they used to, you know what I mean? Like Gears and Halo and Fable were pretty big before, but all those franchises are really not as big as they were. Like even Halo, which is like one of the biggest franchises in gaming history, now in a modern context, it's not the same thing. And it's only one property. So this is Microsoft's attempt to be like, we now have the such a great library of exclusive stuff that you're going to be stupid to not get a Game Pass. You're going to look like an idiot not getting Game Pass, right? So that sounds fine, right? That sounds all well and good. But the reason why I think this is really troublesome is because I think 10 years from now, right? This console generation we're heading into right now with Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5, it's safe to say, and hold me to this, this is the last home console generation. And I think that games, it's very clear that games are just going to continue moving into like this streaming model, right? And so Microsoft is in there early. Like they have Game Pass. There's really nothing that competes with it. Like Stadia is just garbage. And that was just a really bad attempt by Google. But Microsoft really has the opportunity here to be the first one to get this right and to just leave the consoles behind. Because people, once you get a TV that can play a modern game off of like a web browser, there's really not going to be a reason to buy a home console ever again, right? So as everything's moving into like the streaming model, this acquisition is troublesome to me because it reminds me of like the streaming movies and shows business, right? So Netflix comes out and Netflix shows everybody that, streaming shows and movies is the future. And now no one buys Blu-rays anymore, etc., right? And it was really great because there was a certain point in time where everything was on Netflix, right? So Warner Brothers, all their movies were on Netflix. Disney, the Marvel movies, they were on Netflix. You could just have a Netflix account and everything was there. But then as the years went by, Disney was like, why would we have our stuff on Netflix when we have our enough of our own exclusive stuff that we can make our own streaming model, our own streaming service. So Disney goes and gets their exclusive properties. They take it off of Netflix and then they put it on their own thing. And Warner Brothers does the same thing through HBO. And now there's a million different streaming services. There's Hulu, there's Netflix, there's Apple TV Plus, there's Amazon is getting into it. They have their own exclusive properties. Like everyone has their own streaming service now. And so this dream of solving the problem of cable, where you had all these channels and you have to buy different packages, streaming looked like the future where you could finally have everything under one umbrella. And so then all these companies come and they start fragmenting and splitting up that market. So now you have like 5 different streaming services that you pay for. And so it's really annoying and it's actually worse for the consumer because now it's like, all right, well, I have to pay Disney $5 a month and then I pay Netflix this amount of money a month and then I pay this guy this other amount to watch my shows. And it basically just turns right back into the problem it was trying to solve of these giant bloated cable packages where you're paying like all these different companies, different money. It just becomes this pie that's so fragmented. It becomes the problem that it was supposed to solve, right? So it becomes this problem. And with gaming, it's going to be the exact same thing. So this is like one of the early moves in that direction. Game Pass is going to be the future, right? And eventually, Sony's going to be like, all right, well, we're going to have our own streaming service now. And we're not just going to let Microsoft have 100% of the pie, and we're going to buy Warner Brothers. And now, if you want to play Batman, any Rocksteady games, if you want to play Batman, we have Batman and Microsoft, we have Batman and we have Spider-Man, and Microsoft has, Doom Guy and Halo. And then, Ubisoft is going to come through and maybe they'll be on both, but maybe they'll make their own streaming service. And Amazon's going to get into this. Like Amazon and Apple 100% are going to do it. Google's going to do it. And everyone is just going to keep carving up the pie, and it's going to be worse than buying a console. No one's really talking about that. No one is talking about how everyone's kind of excited how, Game Pass is going to have all these amazing games on it and stuff. But I'm just thinking, like, I personally don't want to go into the streaming future for games, right? I'm one of the people who I like consoles to a degree. I like controls. I like that there are, the Apple and Nintendo approach of these companies are the only companies that make hardware and software together. And that matters, and I personally think some of the best games ever are the product of and can only have been made because Nintendo was able to make the hardware and the software. They didn't have to just make some generic hardware that suited all these types of games. And then the games are, just kind of like these common denominator, design choices. Like you would have never gotten Mario 64 if like Nintendo didn't take the risk of making the analog stick the center of that console. Obviously, there's Wii U's and there's hit and misses here and there. But overall, it's made the industry better. And when I see this acquisition and I think about what this means for streaming and stuff, like it's just, I personally think it's going to be a scary thing where I fear having to have like 5 different subscription models, 5 different subscriptions that I pay for just to be able to play like, I got to play Doom and it's only here, paying $20 just for Doom. And then I'm paying $20 to Sony just for Spider-Man. And then I'm paying $20 to another guy just for that. But then, bringing that back to, a Nintendo perspective, or like, how does this affect, people like us who are primarily Nintendo fans, right? It's hard to say because if anyone's going to resist the streaming future, if anyone's like equipped to resist it, it's Nintendo. Especially with the Switch, they finally have their own lane that is uncontested. They are the handheld market. There's no competitors for handheld gaming. Sony and Microsoft aren't even trying. And like I said, this is the last console generation for them in terms of hardware. So they're just going to be streaming after this. And streaming on a handheld is not going to be a thing. Like there's so much that has to go into internet infrastructure in the country and like data caps and like there's so much stuff that needs to happen outside of Microsoft and Sony's control before they can even entertain the idea of selling you, a streaming service that goes to a handheld, right? Like even now, PlayStation has, I think it's called PlayStation Now or PlayStation Go, and it's basically a service where you should be able to stream your PlayStation games to your phone and play with your PlayStation controller off your phone. Like it does not work. It is not good. It's a horrible service apparently. So they're not even close to being equipped to compete with Nintendo in that way. And I don't know if this means that, if Game Pass really takes off, right? And everything really does go streaming, is Nintendo going to take the approach of just having a streaming app that is, all right, this is Nintendo's, right? And it's all the Nintendo stuff. And maybe you can download games to take with you on the go. Like they still want to sell you a piece of hardware with that. I don't know what form it takes, because Nintendo's not going to want to abandon the idea of making controllers and, designing a Mario or a Zelda or a Smash around their controller. And many people might laugh, like they might think that it doesn't matter. Why does it matter if you use, a Nintendo controller over an Xbox controller? The Xbox controller is great, but Nintendo's really good at what they do, man. The Joy-Cons are really, really good. Like outside of the drift issue, which is just, I don't even understand how that's still a problem 3 years into a console cycle. I'm just talking about the design of it, like in terms of, they really do innovate. And a streaming future, a future where Nintendo doesn't make hardware means that there's a limit to how much they can innovate. And I mean, there's a lot of question marks in terms of how they're going to survive or manage in that kind of future. Maybe they'll just, make a handheld that it's cheaper and they make most of their money off of you paying the subscription model. And they could probably get away with that because, Nintendo they don't need to buy any studios. Like Microsoft just paid $7.5 billion for Elder Scrolls and Doom. Those are like the biggest names from this acquisition. Whereas like all those games combined, all those properties combined don't have the appeal or the financial success of Mario or Pokemon or Zelda, right? So Nintendo, if they do go that route, they're going to have a lot more wiggle room in terms of people are going to be willing to pay to play Mario Kart, and stream that. I don't think they're going to have a problem with that. I think the problem is going to be, what does hardware look like after this generation is over? Like, I think we're going to get a Switch 2, and I think the Switch brand is going to last like 10 years, and there's always going to be a market for buying, your kid something that is, just an indestructible, Switch Lite type of device, and he just plays Pokemon on it. There's always going to be that appeal, but it's going to be interesting seeing how Nintendo deals with this streaming stuff. And yeah, I think I might be reading a little too much into that, but also just thinking about the gaming landscape as a whole, and having a more of a deep conversation. Like everything, we're all kind of speculating. Obviously, a lot of stuff is left to be seen, and especially after 2020 and how insane this year is, like so much can change, in the course of a year. But when I saw this acquisition, and those are the things that I thought about immediately, and that's what that means to me just in terms of gaming. So the other big news from this past week for Nintendo fans specifically is that Nintendo has announced that the 3DS has officially ceased production and is discontinued as of September 16th, 2020. Whatever stock is available now is the final stock. The 3DS is Nintendo's fourth handheld game console. It went on to sell over 75 million units, and it lived a glorious 9 years. Came out February 26, 2011, and ceased production September 16th, 2020. Rest in peace to my son. I love the 3DS, man. The 3DS... wow, man, that's probably, now the Switch is this hybrid thing, but when it comes to just dedicated handhelds, the 3DS was just the GOAT, the greatest. That library was insane. There's so much to talk about when it comes to the 3DS, and like we do on this show, what we're about is we're trying to give you the news, right? We're trying to also tell stories and have fun, but we're trying to put things in a galaxy brain context. You know what I mean? I really want to try to always talk about games in a more interesting way. I kind of just fed up with a lot of, gaming podcasts. It's like, oh, we have 30 minutes. And then, you barely get into anything deep. And you kind of just, a lot of the stuff is stuff that we all already have heard a million times. And, the purpose of this show is for us to really talk about things in a more interesting and deep way, right? So the 3DS comes out, at a point in Nintendo's history where they could do no wrong, right? So the Wii had come out, and the Wii had sold 100 million units, and it was the biggest Nintendo home console. It still is the highest selling Nintendo home console ever, right? The DS became the biggest purely gaming system ever in terms of sales, 150, a little more than 150 million. And unlike the PS2, people bought it because it played games. They didn't buy it because it played DVDs. It's my shade. That's my little shade at the PS2. Like, it holds the crown for the best-selling gaming system ever. And I'm like, dude, if you look at the attach rate for the PS2, if you look at how much software was sold, dude, it sold so little software for a system that sold 150 million. Like, they sold more software on other PlayStations. They sold more software on like, Nintendo systems that sold half as much, let alone the DS, right? So to me, you guys can argue with me, you can call me a fanboy if you want. The PS2 is a false prophet, bro. That console is not number one. The real number one best-selling system of all time, pure gaming, it was the DS. So the 3DS is following that, right? It's following like the Wii and like the phenomenon around the world and the Wii balance board. Just that alone sold like more than some game systems have sold. And the DS is just this huge thing, Nintendogs and all that, right? So Nintendo's on fire, right? And they put out the 3DS, and the launch for this console is not horrible at first, but it became really bad, right? So it did pretty well like in the first month or two. And then it immediately just went off of a cliff, right? And one of the interesting things, there's a lot of reasons for why that happened. I mean, it came out at $250, which was a lot for a handheld. It also didn't really launch with anything that was like a big, they didn't launch with any big games. They had like Pilot Wings Resort. It was like a Wii Sports like / Pilot Wings cross thing, and famously horrible game Steel Diver. And so the 3DS didn't have great launch software, but they actually took what they were trying to do with that system. And one of the things people kind of don't remember as much or talk about is that if you go back, you'll see that their emphasis for the 3DS was actually the reason why they didn't have like this big marquee title at the beginning was because they were betting on the pre-installed like software. They had these little mini games that were installed into the system. They just came with every 3DS, and they wanted that to be, the thing that very much like the Wii had the Mii Maker, and the making Miis became like this phenomenon that helped the Wii sell, and it came with Wii Sports. They wanted to pack in software that kind of made the system this phenomenon, right? So they had Street Pass, and they had Face Raiders, I think it was called, and it was like an AR game. The system came with these augmented reality cards. It was like this little Mario question mark block, and you'd put it down on a table, and when you look through your 3DS camera, you'd see like Mario or Samus or all these Nintendo characters pop out in your real life desk, and you could see it through your 3DS. And obviously the big thing, it's called the 3DS, so it has a 3D screen without glasses, which at the time and even now is still really, really impressive, right? So I think they were banking on this effect, and this technology is going to be so cool that people are going to go crazy for this system. And at the time, 3D was just such a big thing in that era. Like Avatar had come out in theaters, and it became the biggest movie ever. And it was like the first real mainstream movie where people really wanted to see it in 3D. And after that movie came out, you saw 3D everywhere. Like you could literally go to the grocery store and find 3D toothpaste. I don't even know what that means, but they were trying to sell me it. Like 3D toothpaste, Crest 3D, whatever. And the 3DS was very much in line with that. Like 3D TVs were a big thing back then. People were talking about. Every movie was coming out in 3D now. So it kind of came out, and there was a lot of problems with the 3D. The first thing was that they had to issue like a health warning, because technically if a child's eyes are still developing, it could potentially hurt their eyes to look at this 3D screen. The second thing is that because it's glasses free, and it's on a handheld, typically when you use a handheld, you're moving the system a bit, right? So if you were to move the 3DS, it would break the effect. And so you had to keep your face centered and play it centered. You couldn't shake it around and stuff, which is a huge problem design-wise, because a lot of the AR stuff and a lot of the games that they would later put out for the system, like Star Fox or like Mario Kart, they wanted to sell you on these gyro controls. And it's like, well, the gyro controls just ruin the 3D effect. So it's one or the other. So they had a hard time with the 3D. And then when they finally put out a game, the big games that were supposed to sell you on the 3D, it kind of was like mixed results. Like Mario 3D Land probably was the best example of why you needed 3D, but it never had a game or a moment that was kind of like Wii Sports, where when you swing the tennis racket, you're like, oh, this makes sense. I get why this is awesome. Proof of concept right here. There were always games that you could just turn the 3D off and you're like, yeah, this game is still great without the 3D. I don't really know why I need it, right? So the 3DS starts selling really poorly. And, I think the first like big games that came out for it were like Ocarina of Time and Star Fox 64 remakes. So, those are both great games, but they're remakes and the people are just generally not going to be as excited about those games. So Nintendo had to really like turn it around with the 3DS because the launch was horrible and the company starts losing money. And so they redesigned the system. They put out the 3DS XL. It launches with New Super Mario Bros. 2. And the software finally starts coming out at a very aggressive pace. Like everything finally aligns. And then you start getting like every couple of months or every month, there was like a nice, really big, good game to buy. And everything turns around completely. And then by the time that like Animal Crossing came out in 2013, that's when when Animal Crossing and Pokemon came out and Mario Kart 7, it was like, all right, now we're good. Everything is finally okay. They turned it around. And the system went on to sell really well for even as recent as like 2 or 3 years ago, it was selling pretty decently. So they turned that around, unlike the Wii U. And it's actually a very interesting thing because the late Satoru Iwata, before he passed away, the last two, the only gaming systems that he was responsible for at Nintendo were the DS, the Wii, the 3DS, and the Wii U, and the Switch later on. But, a lot of his legacy is in how the 3DS and the Wii U failed, and that gave birth to all the great stuff we have on the Switch. Like all the mistakes that they made on those two platforms really paved the way for the Switch. So yeah, the 3DS ended up being, amazing. I think there's some really interesting things that I think this system's going to be remembered for, right? So, the huge mistakes that they made with that system and then how they turned it around with software, it really kind of cemented that a lot of the stuff Iwata was saying in those years when people were really criticizing the company and saying, you guys are like blowing it completely. You guys just need to go third party. You need to stop making hardware. You need to just make iOS games and put your games on PlayStation. Every time Nintendo's not doing well, everyone just says the same three things, right? And then they turn it around and everybody is quiet like they are right now with the Switch. But, he was right about a lot of stuff. I think that the company has to experiment and make something interesting and new to stay alive. But experimentation inherently means that you're just not going to hit the mark every time. And so with the 3DS, they definitely messed up banking everything on the 3D feature. And eventually they kind of just got rid of it and they made the 2DS. And it doesn't even have a 3D effect at all, but it sold amazing because the software was amazing. This console, by the end of its lifespan, it's definitely the greatest. Like, it might be one of the best gaming libraries probably ever. Like, I'm not even exaggerating with that. I think it's way better than the DS's library. Not even close. I think it's better than the Game Boy Advance's by a lot. I think it's better than almost any game console, even just like home consoles and stuff. If you really look at the 3DS, it has an insane library. By the end of it, it killed it. So we talked about earlier how, in a lot of ways, even now, after they turned it around, the system ended up selling 75 million units, which is half as much as the DS, right? So as a sequel to the DS, you can consider that maybe a failure. But, that it's still outsold like the Game Boy Advance. It's about at the same amount of as the Game Boy Advance. But as far as Nintendo handhelds go, it's definitely on the lower end of sales. Like the Game Boy sold way more than 100 million. And it's interesting to think about the 3DS and how awesome it was. But then, it was playing in a different landscape. But it did clobber and it did destroy the PlayStation Vita. Like the other interesting thing about this system, the other thing this system's going to be remembered for is that even with a bad launch and, the competition from mobile games and like the iOS, who that really like snatched up the DS's casual market, which is why a lot of people said the 3DS was failing. It showed that like Nintendo had to pivot to the core gamers and just make great games for core gamers. And the 3DS was really the turning point of where they stopped trying to appeal to that casual, like the Wii U as well. But you'll see that in their designs, in terms of like their lineup for software, there's a very specific moment where they kind of pivot into just appealing to people who love video games and not just trying to appeal to like the Wii and DS's casual market with like Nintendogs and stuff like that. And the other interesting thing is that this was the last time that anyone ever tried to come at Nintendo's mobile market with competition. Sony had a pretty successful, Sony launched the PSP alongside the DS, right, in the mid-2000s. And at that time, Nintendo was getting clobbered by Sony in the home console market. So people were like, well, now Sony's just going to completely delete Nintendo. And the DS ended up obliterating the PSP. Like, it sold double what the PSP sold and sold way more software. But the PSP was still pretty successful. Like, it sold 70-something million, kind of along the lines of the 3DS, right? So then going into round two, a lot of people were like, all right, well, the DS was kind of a phenomenon, and we doubt Nintendo can keep it up. And now Sony's going to launch an even better handheld device, and we're going to see if I think people really thought the Vita was going to destroy the 3DS. It's way more powerful. It actually had bigger names at launch with like Uncharted and a couple other games that at the time were big names. And it's just had a way prettier screen and all that. And the 3DS went on, despite having a bad launch, despite having no real launch games, despite being overpriced, despite the 3D effect scaring off like, their main demographic, which was, younger kids. The 3DS deleted the PS Vita. It memed on the Vita. The Vita sold so poorly that we don't even know how much it sold because Sony stopped reporting the numbers. It's just like, it's a famously failed like Wii U level system for Sony. Maybe not so much like the Wii U since it's not a home console, and like clearly the PlayStation brand is more a home console thing. But this was the last time anyone tried, to really contend Nintendo's handheld market, and they failed so miserably that with the Switch, they have the entire lane to themselves. I think the PS Vita maybe sold like 10 million, but again, no one's really sure because Sony stopped reporting the numbers like really early on. That system is a huge flop, and the 3DS clobbered it, like destruction, right? So, I mean, everyone's talking about their favorite games for the 3DS. That's interesting. There's a million great games, obviously. My favorites are, Ocarina of Time is my favorite game ever, and I finally got a remake to that. So for me, that and the Majora's Mask remakes are my favorite, and probably Mario 3D Land. I played that an insane amount. But talking about our favorite games for that platform are boring. It's always, as usual, it's going to be like some mixture of Mario, Metroid, Pokemon, Zelda, So I wanted to focus more on like my favorite 3DS like moments and what I really remember that system for. Number one is Street Pass. Street Pass was so cool. And I think that got me so excited to bring my 3DS places. And I'm really surprised that their plan to make Street Pass the center of the console and like at launch, this was what you should care about and this is what you should play, collecting the puzzle pieces and like the Find Me game where it's like an adventure style game. That stuff legitimately I thought was just really, really, really great and really fun. And I actually really missed that on the Switch. And I just remember going places and you'd see the green light come on and it would give you some stuff that was like bonus stuff for your other games. Street Pass was just so cool. What a great concept. And I think that really was like the number one thing I loved about the 3DS. And I just can't tell you how many times I was excited to bring my 3DS everywhere. And like I'd be on my way to work and I would just see the little green light and I'd look around and see if, like, oh, who's the guy with the 3DS? Like maybe I could see him. So yeah, I think Street Pass was the biggest thing. I think Swap Note, we talked a little bit about that on the last episode. It eventually got abruptly canceled for some NSFW reasons, but Swap Note was great. I remember just drawing notes, sending them to like my friends that have 3DS, and that was awesome. Another interesting thing that Nintendo hasn't dabbled in before or after is they had a app called Nintendo Video. And this was kind of their attempt to make a video service that was all about 3D movies and shows. And the one that was really funny and like the one I enjoyed the most was called Dinosaur Office, which was made by College Humor. It's interesting. College Humor used to be so huge. I don't know if they're still like on people's minds or anything, but College Humor, a lot of famous comedians, like a lot of the biggest comedians ever, they used to write and create content for College Humor. And so it was a big get back in, 2011, 2012, 2013 to have College Humor making content for this Nintendo app. And they had an exclusive show called Dinosaur Office, and it was like claymation, and it was really genuinely funny. Like it wasn't anything too risque, it was on a Nintendo platform, but it was funny and it was like well animated and it looked good in 3D. So yeah, I think that was like I think those pre-installed apps, the AR stuff I thought was like, I don't think anyone really went crazy for those because it was kind of just visual. There wasn't much you could do with that. But Street Pass, Swap Note, and the Nintendo Video app, I think those were really successful at what they were trying to do, and they really made that system feel unique. That's something that you wouldn't have seen, and you haven't really seen it. You definitely don't see it on the Switch, anything like that. The Switch is so much more just focused on the actual games, and they're not trying to make interesting OS, software and stuff. Oh, and you know what? Before I forget, one more app that was amazing on the 3DS was the activity log. It counted your steps and it counted your playtime in such detail. I remember I was on a trip like in El Salvador and we climbed this mountain and it was an insane hike. It was an all day type of thing. So I brought my 3DS and I got to see exactly how many steps it took to count, to walk all over this mountain and travel. I went to Spain with my 3DS. Like the 3DS, man, that I'm telling you, that system has such a special place in my heart. And it was a lot of the stuff that made it really special was the stuff that was special about the OS, the built-in software, which actually now, earlier in one of the early episodes, I think you guys heard me defending how the Switch OS is very bare, but it's kind of nice how elegant and like it's just games, But now that I'm talking about the 3DS, I'm like, dude, like I want to count steps, I want to Street Pass, like I want to do all this stuff that I did on my 3DS, man. And the activity log was also just so detailed at telling you your playtime for all your games, and it had all this data that was really cool to look at. And at the end of the 3DS, like when I was finally ready to put it in the garage, I remember like looking at my activity log and seeing like how many games I put over 100 hours into. The Wii U had an activity log that was like horrible compared to 3DS. Like it didn't just outright tell you your playtime. You had to like click on it. And like now on the Switch, they kind of have it. It's not as specific. It's like, oh, you played approximately 200 hours or whatever. But the other things that the 3DS I think is going to really be remembered for is, Kid Icarus Uprising. I think that game, that's definitely one of my favorite games. I put over 100 hours into it. If you're a Smash Bros fan, it's made by the creator of Smash Bros, Masahiro Sakurai. After Brawl, this is what he worked on. It started as a Wii game, and then it went over to the 3DS. The game is famous for breaking your hands because it came out before the XL came out. And even on the XL, it would probably hurt a little bit. But on the original base model 3DS, this was this thing cramped your hands, man. Like you had your right hand was using the stylus to aim on the touchscreen, and your left hand was holding the joystick to move. And it was a really, really fun game. I can't think of a single game that kind of is even in the same genre, because the first half of every level is Pit flying to where he needs to go, and it's kind of like a Star Fox on rail shooter when you're flying, but then it becomes a ground combat game. And it really was awesome. And it had an online multiplayer mode. It had like a million different customizable options and stuff. And for them to go back, take this like dead franchise from the NES and the Game Boy and completely redesign it, to look the way that Pit was redesigned for Smash Brawl. And it was just such a unique game, and one of the things that I want Nintendo to do more moving forward. And my favorite things on every Nintendo platform is, of course, Zelda's my favorite game series ever. I want a new Zelda game always, right? But I really look forward to when they do stuff that is a new IP or is just completely new. You know what I mean? So for the Wii U, it was Splatoon, and that's like probably my favorite Wii U game next to Pikmin 3. And on the 3DS, it feels like Kid Icarus Uprising was the closest thing we got to that. Outside of Kid Icarus Uprising, a lot of stuff was really great sequels to franchises that we already liked, right? But this game really felt brand new. Like Pit as a character wasn't new, but the old games don't even play anything like Kid Icarus Uprising, and it has such a heavy emphasis on like the narrative and the characters, and the whole time that you're flying around shooting stuff and playing, there's a lot of conversations going on, and it's just a great game, and they put a lot of effort into that, and I want to see more. More Kid Icarus Uprising, sure, but also just let Sakurai and all these creatives that are famous at this company, right? Aonuma and Koizumi and all these guys that are famous for making amazing Nintendo games. I want them to make new stuff. You know what I mean? Like, I would rather have, now that Smash Ultimate is coming to a close and Sakurai's almost done with the DLC, please just give him a blank check to make anything he wants. I'm actually annoyed that people want Kid Icarus Uprising 2 so bad, because as much as I'd enjoy that, I want him to do something that is as fresh as Kid Icarus Uprising was. And making a sequel inherently won't be as fresh. Just give him a blank check, let him make something completely new that I've never seen before, that has nothing to do with anything they've ever done. And speaking of Sakurai and his games, the 3DS was the first time that Super Smash Bros. Was ever on a portable. And Smash on the 3DS was awesome. Yeah, I broke my joystick and I had to get it fixed. And, it seems like an ongoing theme in Sakurai's games is that you're either going to break your hands or your controller or something. Something is breaking when you're playing his games. Okay, so for Smash, I broke my 3DS and I played that game so much. And I remember being at work and just like taking out my 3DS when there's downtime and being able to play Smash. It suits a handheld so well. And it looked great. It had a mode that was exclusive to the 3DS version, which I wish they would bring back for the Switch, called Smash Run, where you have a limited amount of time to like explore this labyrinth or map. And you're basically collecting power-ups so that at the end, once the timer goes down and you're done exploring, they put you into a match where you use everything that you collected. And it was really, really fun. It was way better than what they have in Ultimate for World of Light. And it's way more fun than the single player modes they had in Smash for the Wii U. So Smash on the 3DS was so cool. It was so awesome. And it's basically like a second game, because they were not able to share all the assets. So they basically made two games at the same time, the Wii U version and the 3DS one, and they came out at the same time. But they really are different games, and they had different stages that suited the portable version, and they had different stages for the home console version. And you still got like the DLC on both at the same time and the same patches and stuff. It was awesome. I remember one time I was taking the subway home in Manhattan, and this is like a moment that's out of a commercial. Like, this is funny that this actually happened. I saw a stranger sitting across from me, right? Some young dude, and he's playing his 3DS, and I'm playing my 3DS. I kind of like show him that I have my 3DS, and I show him I'm playing Smash. And then without saying anything, this is all just nonverbal communication. He looks surprised, and then he shows me his 3DS, and he's playing Smash also. So then I'm like pointing to him and like, you want to play? Like, you want to go? Like, you got a problem, bro? We're going to settle this we're going to settle this on Battlefield right now. So I make a room and he joins the room and we play Smash and we didn't talk at all, right? So if you're an introvert and you are a complete hermit and human interactions give you insane anxiety, this is exactly what you want. This is why the 3DS was for you, because you could do stuff like this without speaking to your fellow man, all right? You didn't need to talk to anybody. Just show him what you're playing, and then he joined my room, and I proceeded to waffle iron this man's nuts. Like, I bodied him. He played Falco, and I was playing Link. But at that time, I had already kind of started going to competitive tournaments. So he just wasn't ready, man. And it was like I was memeing on him, and I'd like save the replay and show him like, oh, hey, I saved the replay. Like, can you see that I did that? Like, you want more, bro? And so I just proceeded to just stomp his nuts. And it was great. It was so much fun. Like, I'm pretty sure like he got off at the next stop, even though I don't even think that was his stop. I think he was just like, I need to get away from this person because I am embarrassed. All right. I just made a fool of myself. Everyone in the train can see I'm sweating. This is not good. So he just got off immediately. And then, I had a great time. I laughed. It was amazing. And so the 3DS, that's another moment that like a personal thing for me in addition to Street Pass that was so awesome, man. Like talking about the 3DS, man, I actually want to play it right now. Another really important thing about the 3DS era for Nintendo is that this is when Monster Hunter it jumped ship from PlayStation to being a more of a Nintendo synonymous brand, right? So we covered that a little bit in the last episode with Monster Hunter Rise and how that's a Nintendo exclusive and how Monster Hunter was really synonymous with the PSP and with PlayStation, when it launched and it really kind of became more popular in Japan as a PlayStation game. And then with the failure of the Vita and the success of the 3DS, Monster Hunter became on the Nintendo family thing with the 3DS, and it sold millions and millions. I think like 4 or 5 millions each. So like probably over 20 million if you combine all the Monster Hunter games on the 3DS. So that's a big deal, and obviously we're seeing why that is important now with Monster Hunter Rise being a Switch exclusive. And the other big thing to remember about the 3DS era is Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem Awakening. This is a really interesting thing because I can't think of any other Nintendo franchise that has had this kind of trajectory. Fire Emblem started on the NES, man. It's an old franchise. And fast forward to the early 2000s, Roy and Marth are in Super Smash Bros. Melee, and they're really trying to popularize that franchise in the West. They start bringing those games to the Game Boy Advance, and they do pretty well. They get reviewed really well, but at some point, they're not really these big sellers. And the Fire Emblem series goes on to the GameCube and onto the Wii, and they don't really do that well on those platforms. And this is like a big first-party Nintendo game, and it's not popular in the West, and it's actually getting less popular in the East at that point. And then Fire Emblem Awakening comes out, and it completely changes the franchise forever to the point where now it's the biggest it's ever been. There's a million Fire Emblem games. It went from being almost dead to now being this really tentpole Nintendo franchise that is extremely popular, and the games have been just amazing for the fan base. I'm still not a huge Fire Emblem guy, so I can't speak to how good the games are, but from the people I know, they're just in love with these games, and this is such a big series now. And the 3DS is when that all changed because, as legend has it, the dev team was told, this is probably going to be the last Fire Emblem game because this franchise is just, it's dying, it's dead. And so they really went crazy with it and changed a lot of stuff, added a lot of things, and really like just went nuts with it. And it paid off big time to the point where it's considered still like a lot of people's favorite 3DS game. And much like the 3DS, it's a perfect game to represent the 3DS because it represents that failure that turned into this huge, huge success. And we've been getting a lot of Fire Emblem ever since. So the 3DS is where everything changed for that series, and when that series became this kind of like staple Nintendo franchise. And the last kind of thing I want to talk about the 3DS era, the last big thing that really encompasses what I think what we're going to remember this platform for, is that the 3DS is when the Zelda series really got its magic back. So obviously, talking about Zelda now, it's just as sacred as it ever was, right? But it wasn't like that back then. Following Twilight Princess, the Zelda series, even with Twilight Princess, things were starting to kind of like the public sentiment and the sentiment among even the fans was starting to get a little soft. You know, in the 90s with Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past and Majora's Mask, this series was like just sacred, revolutionary, like 10 out of 10, you know, reviews through the roof, like everyone, this is the best game series ever. And then I think with Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword and the two handheld games on the DS, Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, people started to feel like the Zelda series was still good, but that it had to become really linear, and it had lost its creativity, and it had certainly lost its place as like the forefront of video games. You know, games like Skyrim came and took a lot of what Zelda started on the NES, and now that was the big phenomenal like pop culture moment. And Skyward Sword came out that same year, and it wasn't a big deal. You know what I mean? It actually sold really poorly by the standards of the Wii. Like it sold like 4 or 5 million copies, but by Wii standards, when you have 100 million Wiis out there, that's really small. And it was less than half of what Twilight Princess had sold just a few years earlier. So the 3DS with A Link Between Worlds, which a lot of people, along with Fire Emblem and along with Kid Icarus, people think this is the best 3DS game. This is when Zelda really got its magic back, and this is the path that led them to Breath of the Wild. So following the criticism of Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword, this Zelda game was a kind of reimagining / sequel of A Link to the Past. It's like a spiritual successor, but it's not linear at all. Like you can basically go to any dungeon at any time, and the way that they got around it was that they had a rental system where at the beginning of the game you kind of just choose between all the classic Zelda items which one you want. And depending on which one you pick, that's which area you can go to first. So eventually you can buy the items and you keep them with you. But it was really cool to have like people had completely different playthroughs, right? So I might have bought the bombs, rented the bombs first, and then done that dungeon. And you might have done the one on the other side of the map that required a completely different item. And it was just so fun. Like it just let you play the game. They had this amazing mechanic where you could become a painting on the wall, and all of a sudden you had to think of classic Zelda scenarios in a completely different way. Like you think you've done enough Zelda dungeons, right? But then they introduced this one mechanic where you can wrap yourself and walk along the walls. And now the things that seemed so common and cliche for a Zelda game became completely new again. You look at it with completely different eyes. So that game is phenomenal. It's amazing. And it really paved the way for Breath of the Wild. And a lot of people said that this was the best game of that year, not just on 3DS, just in general, like across gaming in general. So that game is really going to go down as like a turning point for the series, and when the series found its identity again. And that happened on the 3DS. So the 3DS, we bid you farewell. 9 years, glorious, the GOAT, the best Nintendo handheld ever made, in my opinion. The Switch, I think, is a hybrid, so I kind of don't put it in that conversation. When it comes to just strictly handhelds, I think the 3DS was like unbeatable. It had great third-party support, great first-party games. You know, it was just amazing. So goodbye to the GOAT. Farewell, my friend. And with that, we say goodbye to the 3DS, but we're also saying goodbye to you. Goodbye. This is the end of the show. It was interesting to do this one by myself. I think it was fun. So yeah, I'm Glentendo. That's my show. What's up? You got a problem? Yo, if you're that guy that I met on the subway and you're listening to this somehow, bro, I will do double or nothing money match right now. You don't want the smoke, man. You just don't. I stomped your nuts. Waffle ironed your nuts, bro. Thank you, guys. See you next week. Hope you enjoy the show. You can follow me on Twitter at SuperGlentendo. The Glentendo podcast is a weekly Nintendo/Smash community podcast. Our aim is to have galaxy brain conversations on all things Nintendo. If you like the show, please consider becoming a friendo and supporting at patreon.com/Glentendo. Friendos get early access to the show each Friday. The show then becomes available to all for free the following Monday on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts and Spotify right now and you like the show, give it a good review. It helps support a lot more than you might think. This show is brought to you by our amazing producers, Naomi, Eduardo, and the legendary Riz.